For some context, I'm a 34-year-old female. This happened to me when I was 27. I worked full-time as a researcher at a university, which is where these encounters took place. Now, I'm not a professor or anything, and because of my age at the time, I could have easily been mistaken for just another student wandering around campus. On some days when the weather was nice, I would prefer to spend my lunch hour strolling about the university grounds outside or sitting underneath a shady tree on a bench. I was enjoying the time. I was not just sitting in a cramped corner of a lab somewhere. On one of these days, I was sitting on a bench, enjoying the fresh air, and a male student walking by asked if he could sit next to me. I'm pretty shy and kind of an awkward person, so even though I really would have preferred to enjoy my break alone, I said sure. Why not? The guy initiated simple conversation to which I obliged, but I was careful not to be too forthcoming. He mentioned he had seen which departmental building I came from, which was slightly weird to me. I had never seen this guy before in my life, so why would he take note of me in particular? I pushed the thought from my mind, though. After all, the weather had been quite decent lately, and I had spent nearly all my lunch hours for the past week outside. He asked if I was studying within the mansion department, to which I told him I was not a student. I actually worked there. He told me he was an engineering student and then followed up with asking me out for coffee sometime. I apologized and told them I would have to decline. We parted ways after that, and I assumed I would never see him again. About a week or two went by. I was spending another lunch hour outside on campus, sitting on a different bench in a corner somewhere. Seemingly out of nowhere, the same guy from before asked if he could sit next to me once again. Admittedly, I can't quite remember what we talked about. My mind was reeling a bit at the chances of this exact same thing happening again. I was rather uncomfortable with having to turn this guy down a second time. Sure enough, he asked me once again if we could go out for coffee sometime. I apologized and told them I had a boyfriend and would not be meeting him anywhere again. He left without saying much else. After, I was feeling rather anxious now, but it hadn't reached a level where I had to be too concerned about it. A few days later, I just finished work and was leaving the building to walk to where I had parked my car. The university charged a fortune for parking passes, even if you were employed by them. I had always opted for the free street parking about a 10-minute walk away instead. My walking route would take me down several quiet residential streets with minimal car traffic. Even pedestrian traffic was pretty sparse on the busiest of days. It wasn't until I was about halfway to my car, down one of these quiet back roads, when I noticed someone was walking directly across the street from me, keeping a few paces behind me. I'd only noticed them out of my peripheral vision. I didn't want to flat out turn and stare to let them know I'd noticed them. Besides, it wasn't too uncommon to see someone else walking. I was just trying to be aware of my surroundings when walking the streets alone. I had to make a few turns coming up anyway. A chance they would be going the exact same way as me was very slim, but all the same. He did. He made every single turn I did, still keeping pace directly across from me, a few steps behind. I didn't want to look at whoever this was. I didn't want him to know I was aware of what he was doing. I quickened my pace a bit and was approaching the first of two busier streets before I would reach my car. His pace quickened to keep an exact match with me. That was the moment I began to panic. I was sure he was following me. After that, I started to full-out jog to cross the first of the busier streets. He started to run to keep up behind me and was now on the same side of the street I was. I was nearly to my car, but I had to cross that last busy street and go about 100 meters before I would be there. It was crossing that street that worried me the most. I often had to stop and wait a good minute or so before it was clear enough to do so. If that were the case this time, it would catch up to me easily. Somehow, as if the stars had aligned for me, as soon as I made it running to the busy street, I had a large gap to cross. I booked it as fast as I could, finally turning around once I'd made it through. I wanted to scream at the man who had been pursuing me. It was him. I could have suspected at first, but now it was confirmed. It was that same engineering student I had turned down for coffee those times. "Why are you following me?" I yelled at him from across the busy street. "I just want to talk to you," he yelled back. I didn't even answer him. I mean, the answer was obvious from the start. I was certainly never going to give my time to someone who was following behind me and chased me for an entire kilometer. I kept moving quickly to my car, determined to get the hell out of there. I didn't even care if he saw which one was mine. It seemed he had given up on following me and didn't try to cross the road after. To my relief, I got home and broke down. I mean, worse things have happened to other people, no doubt. And he didn't have the chance to harm me, fortunately, but I was very shaken. I had some anxieties walking to and from work after. It wasn't long before a coworker and I would walk most of the distance back to our cars together. I even changed where I started parking for a time. A few weeks passed by since the incident, and I had not seen that particular guy around campus at all. I had started spending my lunches in the lab instead of outside. Occasionally, I would go to the student center to buy lunch instead. There's one particular day the food court was packed almost shoulder to shoulder. I was standing in line at a burger stall when I heard a guy trying to get someone's attention through the crowd. I looked up. There he was waving to me, trying to push his way through the mass of people. I panicked. I started to cause a scene and yelled at him to leave me alone. His face dropped as people began to stare at him, and he slinked back into the sea of students. My heart was pounding, and I was shaking. I don't even remember if I ended up actually getting my food after. I went back to work, and from then on, I was even more focused on my surroundings than I ever was before. It's been 5 or 6 years since then, and I still do work there. I'm relieved to say I never saw him again after the food court, and I haven't had any other harrowing accounts on campus. I'm diligent about being aware of my surroundings, especially when I have to walk to and from alone. The funniest thing is the guy never even told me his name, so I couldn't report an incident to the campus police or anything. All in all, I'm just glad I never saw him again. I can only hope he didn't do this to anyone else before or after me. My wife and I have a really unique setup in our house. My wife is a strict vegetarian, you see, but I wouldn't give up meat to save my life. She also really doesn't drink, and I'd like to have some beer every day personally when I get home from work. She's so strict about this that she actually worries about our food and stuff getting mixed together. It's sort of obsessive, compulsive, I guess. So in order to not have her worrying about it, I let her use the kitchen refrigerator for her food and bought a second smaller refrigerator for my food and beer. I kept this one out in the garage. I know it must seem sort of weird for a husband and wife to have their food completely separate from one another, but I never really thought about it that much. We didn't often have meals together. Rather, we just eat whenever we felt like it, really. For my wife, at least, it was much less of a social thing than it was simply a necessity. Plus, I like to eat much later into the night, and she wouldn't touch a single thing after 7 p.m. For most nights, I got used to going over to the garage door and didn't even bother turning the light on. I had to use the hallway light to see my way over to the refrigerator. Open it up quickly, grab what I wanted, and then rush back into the house. I would do this over and over. I didn't actually use the 2-car garage for much of anything else. My wife and I parked our cars in the driveway mostly. I did have 2 old motorcycles that I didn't really use anymore, and a broken down Ford Mustang along with some old boxes stored in there. Though one night my wife had already had her food, and she decided to go to bed pretty early. It was about 10 o'clock when I realized I really hadn't had anything to eat again. This was not too out of the ordinary, since my wife and I didn't really eat together. We both often forget to eat until it was really late at night. I had been watching some scary movies on Netflix since my wife was in bed. She didn't like that type of stuff. I got up and went over to the garage door, opened it, and went to grab some food. I can't quite explain it well, but for some reason, all of a sudden, I felt very uneasy as I entered the garage. I had never felt that way before, but it was a very overwhelming, scared feeling. I chalked it up to the fact that maybe the movie I was watching was scarier than I'd initially thought. I quickly grabbed what I wanted, slammed the door shut, and made my way back into the home. I fixed myself the food, climbed into my chair, and started to watch my movie again. When it was over, I wasn't really that tired yet though. I was enjoying myself as well, so I decided to go ahead and pop another one in. First though, I needed to grab myself a couple of beers with which to enhance my enjoyment of this upcoming film. On my way over to the garage, I began to remember my apprehension from before. It was odd because I watch these sorts of things all the time. I usually watch them alone as well. It had been years since I'd actually gotten freaked out by one. I tried to be bold and just go about my business as usual. When I got to the garage door, I tried to psych myself up. I told myself I was not going to chicken out. I opened the door, left it open, and cautiously made my way over to the refrigerator while I was holding the door open. Though I began to get extremely freaked out again. I couldn't quite explain why I felt so timid at the time. I was hyper aware of what was going on around me. I got worked up thinking someone must be in the garage with me. Surely it was just a movie making me scared. Though it was worse when the garage door to the house slowly shut behind me. Rather than grab my beer, I jogged over to the door and quickly flipped on the garage light. The garage lights were extremely bright, and since I never used them, they immediately hurt my eyes in the darkness. I groaned and simultaneously heard another groan. I rubbed my eyes quickly and looked over at the far side of the garage. I couldn't see anything, and at first, I thought it must be my imagination. I walked over and looked around. I looked behind the boxes, behind the car, but I didn't see anyone. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, but once I turned around, I happened to glance into the back seat of the Mustang. I jumped in place when I saw someone lying in the back seat of the car, crouched down and trying to avoid being seen. This time, I sprinted over to the door. I rushed into the house, slammed it behind me, and locked the door shut. The garage door opener was inside the home, so whoever was in there could not get out. I called the police. They came and got the guy out. They found a box cutter and a razor blade on him. But that's not the scariest part. The part that got me the worst was that the man had apparently broken into my garage 2 months beforehand. He had been living in there the entire time, surviving off food from my refrigerator every single night. I had walked into the garage without turning the light on. The man had been in there with me. That has been hard to get over. There's nothing worse than taking a wrong turn. Well, let me rephrase that quickly. There's nothing worse than taking a turn deliberately, only to realize much later on that it was the wrong turn. I was driving home from work one night. I always get bored to death, going the same way over and over again. So occasionally, just to keep my mind focused, I try to take a new road and find my way home. I live in a pretty rural area too, so sometimes this can get me pretty lost. This time was definitely one of those. For people who haven't ever really lived out in the country, you might not know how positively frightening it can be to drive down an old dirt road through the hills with no streetlights, surrounded on all sides by trees in the dark. You can't drive particularly fast either, because there are plenty of sharp turns. The road I turned down that night in question had another problem as well. After a very short time on it, it quickly narrowed down to only a single lane. This made the ride even more difficult because it gave me only 2 options. Drive in reverse and get back to the road I'd been driving on, or drive forward and eventually turn around in whatever driveway this road led to. I wish I could explain this in a way that truly conveyed how frightening it was. It was pitch black. My headlights only lit up a small portion of the area in front of me. Everything only slightly up ahead was completely dark, and everything behind me and to the sides was pitch black. I had to drive extremely slowly for fear of running into something dangerous. After much driving, the road took a sudden turn, and my worst fear became true. This did not lead to a driveway. Instead, it turned right into a big, solid metal barrier gate. Like I said, there wasn't a driveway behind it either. I could see there was room beyond the gate to turn my car around a bit. So completely scared out of my wits, I pulled up close to the gate. I got out and of course left my door open and walked slowly over to it. I quickly grabbed it and swung it open. Then I rushed back to my car and slammed the door. It gave me just enough space to drive through. I slowly drove in, turned around, and pulled past the gate. At that point, I should have just driven off and left the barrier gate open, but I'm the sort of person who just can't do that. I mean, I'd opened the gate in the first place. I felt obligated to close it as I left. I looked behind my car just to make sure, and I could barely see anything behind me. The taillights created a small amount of light, but it was not nearly enough to be able to see what I was doing. I didn't have a flashlight either. I should have left, but instead I opened the door of my car. I thought by leaving the door open, I might get more light. Yet it didn't really help. Slowly, I began to walk back to the gate. I was practically blind. I kept my hand on my car as I moved back. When my eyes adjusted, they did adjust enough for me to see the gate. So I reached out and put my hand on it, prepared to pull it closed. No sooner than I had touched the gate, though, I heard very clearly, as if someone was right behind me, speaking directly into my ear. "Get the hell out of here now." I didn't bother with the gate. My fight or flight kicked in for the first time in my life. I ran to the car, when, without even having any control over my body, I jumped in, slammed, and locked the door and hit the gas. As I started driving, I was much more scared than I had even been outside the car. My mind began playing tricks on me, and I began to wonder if someone was hiding in my back seat or something, and I was too scared to look. Though I kept expecting someone to jump out in front of my car at any second, but I never stopped. I kept on driving until I got back to the main road. I turned down it and took the more safe way home. Of course, by the time I arrived, I looked in the back seat. No one was waiting there. Thankfully, my uncle has always told me to keep out of the hills. He said there were some really unpleasant, unsavory, and very dangerous people out there. I used to think he was full of it, but I don't think that much anymore. At the time this happened, I'm from a big city in Germany. That afternoon, I wanted to buy a birthday present for a friend. I planned on taking the subway downtown to where all the shops were. Even though my home city is fairly big, it's considered really safe. So I never really felt unsafe going to friends' houses or downtown all by myself. While I was waiting on the platform, this guy kind of slowly walked past me and stopped just a few meters away from me. I remember he must have been in his late teens or early 20s, and he had these glasses on. While I looked around the platform board since the subway wouldn't arrive for another 3 minutes, I noticed the guy was now staring at me. Being a rather shy girl back then, I very quickly looked away. After a few seconds, I wanted to check if he was still looking. So I peeked a quick glance. Surely enough, the guy was still staring, completely unblinking. This went on until the subway arrived. By then, I was feeling really uncomfortable. Luckily, there had been a few other people on the platform, so I still felt fairly safe. I got on and succeeded in snatching one of the few empty seats left. Since it was close to Christmas and the subway was completely packed, I couldn't see the guy from my seat anymore, so I calmed down, thinking he must have lost me. A couple of minutes later, I got off at my stop and took the escalator up to the street. While standing there on the escalator, though, I got a sudden sharp feeling up my spine and turned around. My heart sank. The creepy guy from the platform was standing just a bit behind me on the same escalator, staring into my back. I tried to calm myself down. This station was a popular meeting spot, and a lot of people who wanted to go shopping got off there. Since it was close to Christmas, he was probably just doing some shopping for his family, right? When I arrived on the street, I turned right, walked down that street, and turned right again at the next corner. When I turned the corner, I quickly looked down the street I'd come from. The guy was following me. I felt really uncomfortable now. I entered a bookshop and hid behind a bookshelf, waiting for the guy to walk to wherever he was heading to. After a few minutes, I went outside, and that was the moment I started to panic. I thought the guy must have walked past. It had been a long time since I'd hid. It turned out, though, the guy was standing just a few meters away, just out of sight, waiting. I should have run back into the store and called my parents to come pick me up. Instead, stupid 14-year-old me hoped there must be a more logical explanation for this guy's behavior. Maybe he was just waiting for someone else. I got out of the store and walked in the opposite direction of where that guy was. I started to walk faster, hoping that if he was following me, I would lose him amongst all the other shoppers that were now around. When I turned right at the next corner as I was walking around the block, I looked back down the street again. He was now even closer behind me. I walked even faster, and I felt like I was about to cry, but I knew I had to keep calm. I turned right once more when I looked back and could still see him behind me. I was now positive he was following me. What other reason would he have to walk around the block entirely without entering any of the stores? I tried to think of a way to escape when suddenly I saw my chance. The street light on the crossing just a few meters in front had just turned red, so I started sprinting as fast as I could. I managed to just barely make it to the other side before the traffic started flowing through. I looked back. The guy hadn't managed to make it across the street in time and was standing on the other side, waiting for the light to turn green again. He was still staring at me, but this time with a really creepy, wide grin. At that moment, I felt as scared as I had never been before in my life. I started running again, this time into a huge department store a few meters away from me. Luckily, I knew that this particular store had another entrance at the back, facing a different street. On that street, there was usually a line of cabs waiting to pick up shoppers. I sprinted through the store and right out the other entrance. To my greatest relief, there was the usual line of cabs. I practically jumped into the first one in tears. I told the cab driver my home address and shouted for him to go quickly. I frantically looked back to the door, expecting the man to burst out any moment. Fortunately, I didn't see him. I'm still thankful that the cab driver instantly started driving and only asked what happened and if I was all right when we were already a few blocks away. In tears and completely shaken, I told him about the man that had been following me and how scared I was. When we arrived at my parents' house, he refused to charge me and waited outside until I was safely indoors. To this day, I'm still grateful to that cab driver. I don't know if that guy who was following me was just playing a very cruel prank on me and just wanted to scare me, or if he had something way more sinister in mind. When I was about 13 years old, I used to love going to explore out in the hills around my aunt's house. It was really fun, and I often found some really interesting things out there too. One time, I stumbled upon this cave. Part of me really wanted to go and explore it, but I knew it wouldn't be a good idea by myself. I decided to save that for another time. When I went home though, it really began to bother me. I regretted not exploring that cave. I felt like I was some sort of coward, and I really didn't want to feel that way. I wanted to go back and find out what was in there. About a month later, I went to stay with my aunt again. This time, I knew I was going to seek out that cave and explore it to its fullest. I brought a flashlight, a snack, and some water as well. I didn't really need much because I knew it would be a shallow cave, and it wouldn't take me very long at all. After about an hour of exploring the hills, I finally found that cave again. I guess I should explain the kind of cave it was. It was on the rocky side of a hill, and the entrance was quite short. I would have to get on my belly and push myself under it. Looking at it, I knew it would be an extremely tight fit. My curiosity was really strong though, so I decided to go ahead and go for it. I got down on my belly and slowly began to crawl into that cave. I wasn't sure how deep it was, or if it ever got any taller. What I was sure about was that it was very dark inside. The entrance was so small that not much light was able to get inside it. Thank God I decided to bring the flashlight with me. Right as I began crawling in further though, I became aware of this really odd noise. A sort of rustling sound followed by a weird shrieking noise. It sent a real shiver down my spine. In a bit of panic, I moved down a bit. I tried to pull my foot out, but I wasn't able to move it because it was throbbing in agony. I cried out a bit, and then I heard that rustling noise again. It was too dark to see anything, so I grabbed my flashlight. The sound was probably just nothing, but I would, of course, be scared until I knew that for sure. I moved my hand on the flashlight, and switched it on, then moved it toward the direction of that sound. I saw the worst possible thing. A cave full of the scariest looking bats I'd ever seen. Only a couple of yards away from me, they were hanging from the ceiling, and all of them were staring at me. I screamed and did my best to pull myself free. My leg throbbed in agony as I moved. I don't know what it was, the crying or the flashlight. But the bats got restless, and they started to fly right at me. Stupidly, but instinctively, I swatted at them to defend myself. Two things happened in that moment. My leg finally pulled loose of the wall, and the bats began to bite me because I'd swatted at them. It felt like I was jabbed with sharp, thin needles. I screamed again and tried to pull myself out of that cave. If you've ever seen the movie Terminator, my experience was very similar to Sarah Connor's climbing through the machinery at the end. My leg was injured now, and I was crawling through an area that my body was wedged into. I was panicked and scared of the bats all around me, trying to bite me. I was scared I was going to get something real bad because I'd just gotten bit. It took me a long time to crawl my way out. I was breathing heavily with fear, and I had never felt so claustrophobic before. It took me a long time to get out, and by the time I did, I was hyperventilating. I tried to stand up on my foot, but my leg gave out. I had to crawl the rest of the way until I was able to get a broken branch on the ground I could use as a crutch. I was hurting really bad, and I was scared I had probably just contracted rabies. I felt super sick. It took me nearly 3 hours to limp back to my aunt's house. In my gut, I just felt I had rabies and was going to die. If I had been more educated about bats, I would have known that only 0.5% of them actually carry rabies. My feeling of being sick was probably psychosomatic, exacerbated by my fear and anxiety of hurting my foot. But I had to get a rabies shot anyway. It wasn't nearly as bad as people might tell you it is, but it's still not pleasant by any means. Turns out my ankle had been fractured, and I had to get a cast for it. Nowadays, I don't go into small caves or other small areas either. I'm completely claustrophobic, and although more educated about bats now, I'm really scared by them. One summer when I was around 5 years old and my sister was around 8. We are both females, by the way. I awoke to hear through our bedroom window my parents shouting loudly on the back patio. This was not a common occurrence, and when they did fight, it was not typically anywhere there was a chance of us hearing. This sort of thing did happen from time to time, though. And though the situation was mildly unusual, we shrugged it off. We shut the window and went back to sleep. We promptly forgot about that whole ordeal. It wasn't until years later when we learned the truth about all that yelling. As a near adult, I overheard my mother explaining the situation to a family member in another room. Apparently, at some point in the night after my sister and I had gone to bed that night, our parents had received an unusual phone call from someone using an electronic interpreter, the same type of technology a person who's deaf might use to make calls and communicate over the phone. Understandably, my parents were a little bit surprised. We didn't know anyone who would use this service to contact us. Either way, they accepted the call, though I'm not sure how the person on the other line introduced themselves, or if they even did at all. They knew the full names of everyone in my family immediately. That was very creepy and alarming. The conversation soon escalated as the person on the other end of the phone line specifically explained what our house looked like. They told my parents they were hiding in our backyard, which was large, dark, and full of all kinds of plants and trees, making it very hard to clearly see. There were too many places to look. At this point, the tormentor made it clear they had intentions of entering our home and killing my sister and me. At this point, understandably, my parents were beginning to become frantic. Sure, there was a chance that nobody was out there and this was just some kind of cruel joke, but that notion was not worth the risk of believing. My dad asked if they really were where they said they were. If so, what were my parents doing at that moment? What were they wearing? Just like that, The person on the other end of the line explained exactly what my father was doing mid-action, exactly what they were both wearing, where certain items on our patio were placed. The expression on my mom's face as he said this, every detail. My dad, a rough guy with a heart of gold, charged into the night, ready to kill any person he encountered. Neither of my parents had cell phones. I don't think they were even a thing at this time. My mom grabbed the phone, which had been put down by my dad, and called the cops. As brave and stupid as my dad was for venturing into the dark that night, he found nothing out there. When the cops arrived shortly thereafter, they found nothing either. The police were not able to trace the call because of the electronic interpreter, which they said was a fairly common device used by people trying to anonymously harass others over the phone. Nothing ever came of this incident, and as I said, I was not told about it until at least a decade after it happened. Was this the work of a former friend or enemy trying to play some kind of cruel joke? Was there an actual murderer in my backyard? I guess we'll never know. The worst thing that ever happened to me happened when I was only 13 years old, but that was back in the 1970s. I can only tell this story anonymously because even though it's really possible all the people involved might be dead, that's not a chance I want to take. I had always been a hiker, and I liked being out in nature. I actually got reminded of this story because I was watching a movie on Shudder. Although the situation was entirely different, there was an aspect that made me think about this. I really liked being alone in nature. I didn't mind being out all night and sleeping on the ground in my sleeping bag. In fact, if I could, I'd spend several days out in nature all by myself. In the area I grew up in, there was definitely a lot to explore as well. This happened on a fall day when I happened to have a few days off school added to the weekend. I don't remember exactly why that was, and I suppose it doesn't really matter. I wasn't exactly the biggest guy in school, so having a day off was always something to look forward to in my book. So when I went hiking on this day, I was really energized. The first day went really well. I got a lot of distance covered and saw a lot of things I had never seen before. I came across this nice creek and decided to follow it for a while. I followed it until I came across a little waterfall, which I thought was really neat. I decided to do a little bit of skinny dipping in the creek, which was a bit odd to me. I didn't have a bathing suit on me though, and I didn't want my clothes to get wet out in the wilderness. Besides, what could it hurt? I was always a bit nervous about being naked though, even when I was all by myself. I just could not pass up the chance to go swimming in a waterfall though, and it was one of my best memories. That was about to turn into one of my worst experiences ever. While I was out there swimming, suddenly, I heard a loud shriek. It was a weird noise I had never heard before, and the sound chilled me to the bone. It didn't sound like any animal that I knew. There were, of course, sounds I had never heard before. I didn't know how a bobcat or a mountain lion sounded, for instance. But hearing something I didn't recognize terrified me immediately. Before I could do anything, I could see some movement a bit further up on the hill. I could see several people just cresting over the top. I was frightened. I didn't know what was going on, but the terror I felt took over. Before anyone could see me, I ducked in behind the waterfall. There happened to be a small cave behind it that was just large enough for me to barely fit into. While I was standing there behind the water, I was able to make out what was happening. I was shivering because I had to stand in that chilly water, also out of complete terror of not knowing what was going to happen. Keep in mind that because of the running water, what I could see through the waterfall was not exactly perfect. It was extremely blurry, but I could still make out just a bit. I could see through it that there were at least 4 men, but it seemed to be a 3-on-1 encounter. One man was trying desperately to get away from the other 3. The 3 guys surrounding him were pretty big and looked terrifying. Through the water, I was breathing heavily. I was worried about my clothes and backpack I had left on the other side of the creek. If those guys noticed it, they would know I was there too. I assumed that whatever they were going to do to this guy, they wouldn't want any witnesses. And I could tell it was not going to be a good thing. The lone man stumbled and yelled. As he did, I watched him struggle to get up, and right as he did so, I heard a gun blast. He completely fell down. You know how in movies you shoot someone and they die right away? Yeah, that's not what happened here. The guy was screaming and wailing. The worst sounds I've ever heard in my entire life. It was way scarier than any girl screaming in a horror movie. It was a wail of pain, agony, and fear, and it sounded inhuman. Then there was another gunshot, and the wailing and shrieking suddenly stopped. I had my mouth covered, doing anything I could not to throw up into the waterfall. I felt sick to my stomach, terrified. I felt my soul drop to my feet. I was absolutely sure that the second gunshot had killed that man. I watched in terror as two of the men picked up the body. I was so afraid they would spot all of my stuff there. Fortunately, they never got close enough to that side of the creek. It didn't take very long before they all disappeared. I still felt cold and was shivering. Now I found I couldn't bring myself to get out of the waterfall. At first, I didn't want to expose myself, even for a moment, though much time had passed, and I was sure now the guys were completely gone. I just couldn't even force myself to move. I stood in that cave for several hours before I finally got the nerve to get out from that cave, put my clothes on, and get out of there. I couldn't run though. I was numb, and it was hard to get my legs to move at all, much less run away. My mind was in a state of terror, and it would not go away. I walked back toward my home in a total fog. It turns out I had been so far away from my house, I couldn't do the walk-in one evening. I had to make camp. I slept very poorly, needless to say. It was the sleep you feel when you're still awake, and it was terrible. When I did dream, it was not the type of dream you'd want to hear about. When I got home the following day, I went to my dad and told him what happened. I asked him to call the police, but he didn't. We lived way out in the country, and this was the 70s. My dad told me there were people out in those hills you did not want to mess with, and you didn't call the police on them either, because they wouldn't do anything. He told me the best thing I could do was never tell anyone about it, and just get on with my life. He told me if we got the police involved and those people found out, we'd end up just like that guy they had killed. Of course, I did tell people, but almost everyone didn't believe me. It was just a few people over a long period of time. But now, 50 years later, here I am telling you. In September of 2002, my wife was in her 7th month of pregnancy with our first child. We lived in Ohio at the time, and she wanted a baby shower since most of her family and close friends lived in Baltimore. We planned that we would travel to Baltimore and have the baby shower there on Saturday, October 19, 2002. On October 3rd and 4th, though, we were brought to the horrifying realization that a serial killer was on the loose in the Baltimore, D.C. area. We naturally re-examined our plans, but decided to go through with them all the same. After all, the likelihood of being this sniper's victim was practically zero from a statistical point of view. My wife and I listened to the news of the Beltway sniper in the days leading up to our trip. It was getting a bit scarier as the death count had now raised to 9, and there were 2 additional people who had been wounded. At the 11th hour, we decided we would still go. Around 5 p.m. on Friday, October 18th, my wife and I picked up my mom and my stepsister, and we set out for our trip. The trip was going slowly but otherwise uneventful. We used most of the time to review the plans of what to do when we needed to stop during our trip. The plan was that we would all go together, not dilly-dally, get out of the car and into the building quickly, and vice versa. No one was to stay in the car alone. Well, as it happens eventually, around 12:45 a.m. on Saturday morning, we all needed a restroom break. We pulled off into a rest stop near Frederick and parked right in front of the door to the bathroom facility. The rest area was largely empty, but there was a dark blue Latte, model 4-door sedan parked head. In facing the door to the restroom, I parked right next to this car, and we all quickly reviewed the rules. If I finished first, I would wait for them, and we would all return to the car together. We got out and raced to the restrooms. As I ran into the restroom area, I didn't pay too much attention to the car we parked next to, other than to make sure they didn't open their doors. I finished first and stood by the exit, but stayed inside the building. The doors and the walls were all glass, so I nervously scanned the parking lot for anything looking off. Satisfied that there was nothing ominous in the lot, I turned my attention back to that blue sedan. I travel a lot, so naturally, I took note that their license plates were from New Jersey. In the front seat were two African-American males. The one behind the steering wheel was middle-aged. He was wide awake and staring back at me. Next to him was a sleeping teenager. I remember feeling a sudden chill go down my spine as I observed him watching me. At this time, the authorities hadn't released any info on the snipers, and they didn't know the ominous role the car played in their killing spree. I was ignorant of the danger these two really presented. A few minutes passed before my family returned, and we all ran back to the car in a flash. We sped away and continued on to our destination. As we left, I remember noticing something weird about their trunk area. My family was poorer growing up, so we sometimes had to pop out a broken lock and couldn't afford to fix it right away. We would rig the trunk open using a screwdriver during those times. I remember thinking that's what they must have done with their trunk. It turns out that was the exact hole they shot out of while staying concealed. The baby shower went well, and my wife had fun. We didn't go out for meals or anything but slept and ate at her mom's house in Baltimore. On Sunday morning, it was time to go. We took a much more northern route going back, just to be safe. About a week or so later, once they'd captured the Beltway snipers, you can imagine the renewed chills running down my spine when in the newspaper. The face of the man that had been staring at me when we stopped to pee at the rest stop, John Allen Muhammad, was staring back at me once again. It was also a photo of the car we had parked next to. Scarier still, the report said they had been captured in that exact same rest stop about a week later. I can only assume the teenage boy that had been asleep next to him was Lee Boyd Malvo. Fortunately, they were both in the front seat. This was apparently where they had planned to hide out and sleep between their kills, so they likely wouldn't have done so at this particular rest stop. Therefore, I feel we weren't in the most danger during this encounter. Had we encountered them slightly out of there, though, we may well have been. We were staying in this fancy hotel for my cousin's wedding, and I was around 12 at this time. I woke up very suddenly that morning to a rough shove, assuming it was my sister waking me up. It was early morning, sometime around 7:30 or so. I groggily stepped out of bed and was immediately hit with hairspray fumes. I could hear the sound of someone taking a shower as well as loud, hurried footsteps. I walked to the dresser and pulled out a blouse and a skirt as I got dressed. I heard knocking on my door. I pulled my top fully on and opened it, but no one was there. I was kind of freaked out right now, but I knew it must just be my imagination or something. After all, I just woke up. I left the bedroom and heard the shower shut off as I passed by the lavatory. I then heard my father's heavy footsteps at the end of the hall. There was another restroom there, and I could hear that same hairspray noise coming from inside. So I called out, "Hey, Mom, if you're in there, I need to pee. Dad's in the other bathroom right now." I heard my mother's voice call back, "Alrighty." It was definitely her voice, but that was not something she would ever reply with. I rolled my eyes, though, and walked away. I figured I should go wake my granddad, as I heard heavy snores coming from the room that he was sharing with my parents. In fact, I wondered why my parents hadn't woken him up yet. When I opened the door, though, I was extremely startled to find that the room was empty. Just then, the noises and smell of hairspray stopped as well. I ran downstairs only to see that everyone else was already eating breakfast. I checked my watch and saw it was already 10 o'clock. My mom stared at me, and I started to ask, but my sister interrupted me. "What the heck?" I asked them what was wrong. My sister then replied, "Didn't you just go to the bathroom?" She pointed to the laboratory next to the small kitchen area. I walked over there and pressed my ear to the door. Sure enough, I could hear someone was in. They're washing their hands. I shook it off at first and counted my fingers. All 10 of them, it seemed. I wasn't dreaming. I knocked on the door. Inside the bathroom, I heard a voice calling out, "Alrighty." I looked over at my parents, sister, and granddad, and we were all pale. Behind my back, I heard the lock click, followed by what I swear was... My sister and I were both 16 and 13. We were home alone while my parents were out of state for a couple of days to attend the funeral of a longtime family friend. Our grandfather lived only a couple of miles away and was originally supposed to babysit us, but he trusted that my sister and I would be fine on our own. Instead, he would be on call if anything were to go awry. It was around 10 p.m. on the second night of being alone. I was upstairs in bed trying to sleep after a long day of biking around with a couple of friends. Suddenly, my sister came sprinting up the stairs, which she almost never did unless she was in a hurry for whatever reason. She came into my room and was frantically speaking to someone on the phone. I laid there in confusion while she talked. I don't remember exactly what was said, but once she hung up, she hugged me tight and told me that everything was all right, and Grandpa was on his way. Suddenly, we heard what sounded like a door being kicked open downstairs. Almost immediately afterward, we began to barricade my bedroom door. None of the bedroom doors in the house had locks on them at that time. Once we were done, she looked out the window while I sat there, covering myself with a blanket. All the while, we could hear footsteps downstairs, walking about on our hardwood kitchen floor. My sister urgently looked around my room and asked if I had a bat or anything we could use to defend ourselves. I did. Stored in my closet was my Louisville Slugger that I used when my parents made me play baseball when I was in elementary school. I also had a hockey stick in there, but who would use that as a weapon unless in a very circumstantial situation? She rummaged through my closet and grabbed my bat, then stood next to the door while I ducked down behind her. I thought maybe I should grab that hockey stick, but it was very unwieldy for me, unless the burglar had some sort of PEDS associated with hockey. This was not going to be a very effective weapon for me. We then heard the sound of a gunshot, followed by a man screaming out in pain. The sound of both I can still hear even to this day when I just think about it hard enough. My sister and I were standing by the door, almost in tears, when about a minute later, we hear our grandfather yell out our names, asking if we were all right. We both yelled out simultaneously that we were. My sister and I pulled the dresser and various other objects out of the way of my door, and we both went out into the hallway. We could hear my grandfather on the phone with 911 as we stood at the top of the stairs. When the police and the ambulance arrived, the man who had broken in was taken out on a stretcher, which I later learned was for a shot to the abdomen. My grandfather had come into the same back door and found the man in our kitchen, searching through drawers. He then came at my grandfather with one of our kitchen knives, and that's when he was shot. The man almost died from blood loss, but he ended up surviving. I really hope he learned his lesson both through being incarcerated and by being shot in the abdomen and almost losing his life. But of course, you never know with certain people, especially the infamous ones. There's a convenience store that I go to nearly every single day. I walk there, so I do it not really to get anything, but because it's a pretty good midday walk to get a bit of exercise. It keeps me going. You know, getting up to do something every day. There's a guy I know who is homeless now, but I only assumed it in the first few times I met him. He often hangs out right outside that convenience store. There's a shady little spot in the front next to the propane tanks that has an outlet. I guess the managers of the store allow him and one or two other homeless people in our small town to use that outlet in order to recharge their phones. Well, anyway, he had stopped me in front of this store to talk a few times, although I couldn't really understand everything he was talking about. I had been homeless once before for a short time. I know what it's like to not have anyone you can talk to, so I let him talk a whole lot to me while I worked as a good sounding board. Just recently, he decided to get up and walk with me as I was on my way home from the store. He suggested that I should walk a different way instead. I had told him before the area in which I lived, and apparently, There was a road that went behind the stores and came out behind another street, which was close to my home. He told me he would show me how to get to the trail he was talking about. The weirdest part, though, is that he didn't walk with me all the way to where the trail was. He walked as far as the train tracks and then just pointed me the rest of the way. And actually, he was right. It was a much, much quicker path to get to the way I was going. It was also a lot more shaded and solitary than walking along the busy highway. I found myself enjoying it quite a bit, actually. I would take that way a few times in the day, not really thinking too much about it. It was when I decided to take it once at night, though, that I had a really scary experience. I hadn't stopped to really think about what it might be like to walk back there at night. The actual path was really short, and most of the walk was along a paved road. There were a few homes along the road, so I assumed there would at least be some street lamps alongside as well. Well, when I crossed over from the little path to the asphalt road, needless to say, I was surprised at first by just how dark it was. Yeah, it was really darker than anything I could ever recall in my life. Like I mentioned, there were a few houses along the road, but they didn't seem to have any lights on at this time of night. In fact, there were absolutely no lights on at all, not on any of the telephone poles even. This meant it was a downhill walk that was nearly pitch black outside. I couldn't even really make out where I was going forward, trying to watch the ground to see where I was going. For some reason, at the time, it never occurred to me to just turn around and go back. I wanted to get through walking that way, and I just figured after, I would take the rest of the normal way home. After a few moments, it occurred to me to use the flashlight on my cell phone. Sure, it wasn't the best light there could be, but it did help me find my way a little bit better than without. I couldn't really see what was on the sides of me or anything behind me either, but it was enough to keep me from stumbling on or even off the road. Suddenly, though there was some noise off to the left side of me, I jumped and tried to shine my light over in that direction. Because the light was so weak, I wasn't able to make out what was off to the side. I could see, though, that there was some sort of figure stumbling in a weird gait toward me. He was saying something like, "Give me that. Give me that." I didn't need to make out who or what it was in order to run, though. I took off like a rocket down that hill without even looking back once. I ran and didn't stop until I made it to the store. When I went in, I was startled, and the cashier could tell something was wrong. While catching my breath, I explained what happened. When we went outside, though, that person had completely disappeared into the darkness. I guess whoever it was didn't decide to follow me in the end, but it sure was creepy as hell having them come after me in the dark like that. I started my freshman year of college at a university in my hometown that's pretty nice. I'm not going to share too much about it, but it has a smaller amount of students, enough that you don't really run into people too often. Actually, I lived on campus and was only 17 at the time. I had a Tinder, of course, as I was fresh out of a relationship and looking to experience new things in college. I matched with this one boy, Asher, who seemed nice enough at first. Pretty socially awkward, but I never really minded that sort of thing. I have some anxiety issues myself, so I'm pretty sympathetic to it because of that. I ignored a lot of warning signs I probably shouldn't have. We texted for a while, and he seemed really nice and caring. He wanted to know a lot about me, which I wasn't too keen on sharing. I told him the basics, and we texted pretty regularly. Though he lived on campus as well, he invited me to hang out. At the time, things didn't seem sketchy at all, so of course, I was completely down. When I first met him, though, that's when things started to get a bit uncomfortable. We hung out in his dorm at first, which was pretty standard. Overall, I got cozy with him on his couch. I'd say cuddling, but not quite there. When we started talking more, though, I realized that something was a bit off. He kept making comments that would just put me off right away. I tried to ignore them, though. Things like, "I've never cuddled with anyone before." "Sorry if I'm doing this wrong." And so many comments about how he wanted me to stay forever. Weird word choice. But whatever. He was just trying to do his own thing, and I'd let him down easy. I ended that hangout pretty quickly for some fake excuse and went right back to my room. He kept on texting me and professing how much he was into me. I told him sorry, but I'm not really looking for any kind of relationship. I didn't want things to be romantic. It was a bad lie, but I'm very confrontational, and I didn't want to be mean. It's not like he had really done anything wrong. We just didn't really click. Unfortunately, that was just the start of everything. He would not leave me alone after. Even though I kept trying to de-escalate things, I would keep running into him all over campus and other places as well. I wasn't sure how he would always just suddenly manage to be nearby right when my classes ended. I also wasn't sure why we'd suddenly both be in the dining hall at the exact same time, even though I hadn't changed my regular routine at all. I tried to brush it off though. That was definitely a mistake. I ended up turning him down completely eventually because now I was getting creeped out. I couldn't figure out how he wasn't getting what I was putting out, that I didn't want anything romantic with him. He started to really guilt trip me, telling me about how he was going to kill himself and nobody else would ever love him. I'd been in a manipulative relationship in the past, so I recognized that behavior right away and shut it down. I told him I couldn't even be friends with him if he was going to say stuff like that. In my head, that was that. He actually didn't reply for a while, but when he did once more, all hell broke loose. I was luckily out of town at the time for a concert, so that made me feel a lot better. He immediately went off though, paragraph after paragraph about how horrible a person I was. I was such a high explicit. He needed to put me in my place. All the regular nice guy things you could think of. I could handle that much though. I just ignored all his nasty words. It seemed though, once the regret set in from him saying all those things, he made it his mission in life to win me over however possible. He apologized profusely, told me he could not stand being all alone, and I was his only friend in the world, whatever. Terrible, but at the moment, I didn't really care about that. To prove his dedication to me though, he did the creepiest thing yet. First, he texted me he was outside my room right now. We did not live in the same dorm building, and you can't get into the buildings unless you live there. I don't know how he got in. At the moment, I was not there, and my roommate was also not home, so at least that much was okay. I texted back at that point and told him to leave. Just how creepy that was. He pulled down his last resort. He sent me screenshots of my contact in his phone. On Apple devices, you can fill in tons of information and even have a notes section as well. I could see everything was full. He somehow knew my home address, my room number on campus, my parents' and brothers' names, my pets' nicknames, my whole schedule. It was terrifying because I'm a very private person. The only social media I have is my Instagram, and I've never shared a single thing on it about that kind of stuff. I don't think I'll ever find out how he discovered all of this about me. I blocked him on everything right away and reported him to the school as well. Of course, the school did nothing at all. I still see him around on campus and other places as well, and he still tries to approach me whenever he manages to see me. I always duck and run away as fast as possible, and that's worked for me so far. It's terrifying, though, to think what he might do one day. A couple of years ago, while I was backpacking in Australia, I traveled around by driving a van like many other backpackers there did. It saved a lot of money on accommodations. Typically, I'd sleep in rest areas, gas stations, or wherever I could find a place to park. This one particular night, I'd been driving for quite a few hours and was starting to feel really sleepy. I decided to stop at the next rest area, which happened to be in the middle of nowhere. During the day, parking there might have been fine, but at night it felt like a scene out of a horror movie. There were no other cars parked there. I knew I should have kept going to find a more populated area, but my drowsiness was getting the best of me. There were also no lights whatsoever. I turned off the engine and closed the curtains of my van. It wasn't long before I was awoken by heavy knocking on the side of my van. the voice outside said, "Hey, open up." "It's the police." "Nothing jolts you awake like that." My heart was racing immediately as I adjusted to the rush of adrenaline in my system. They repeated the knocking and the claim that they were the police. My first thought was that I had parked somewhere I shouldn't have. Then again, it was in the middle of nowhere, and it was a rest area. Even in my groggy state, something felt off about the situation. Instead of opening up right away, I decided to slowly move over to one of the windows and peek through a gap in the curtains. Outside, I could make out the shadowy shape of a man standing beside the van. His car wasn't too far away, but it didn't have any lights or official markings. It was clear to me that this guy was not a police officer. Summoning whatever courage I had left in that moment, I shouted, "Get away! I have a gun, and I'm calling the real cops on the radio." Of course, I didn't actually have a gun or a radio, but my bluff seemed to work. The man immediately sprinted back to his car. Adding to the eeriness, someone else emerged from the nearby bushes and joined him in the car. They left within a few minutes after I turned on my van and drove in the opposite direction they had gone. Safe to say, I never slept in another rest area that didn't have at least a couple of other cars parked around. I don't know what those guys wanted, but considering Australia's history of backpacker serial killers, I'm just grateful to be here today. This is a story that I was told by my mother when I was old enough to understand what almost happened. I was only a few weeks old when this occurred. In those days, when a mother had given birth and taken her baby home, midwives were sent from the hospital to check on the baby and mother, usually twice a week at most. My dad was working a lot at the time, so he wasn't home. My mother had put me to sleep and was going about her business in the house. She had already had 2 midwives come earlier that morning. Before I continue, she immediately knew that what happened next was not normal. She had a sudden knock at the door, and someone outside claimed to be the police. We lived in a fairly close-knit community where there were rarely any threats to safety. Most of the people who lived nearby were young, healthy couples who were usually at work during the day. This meant that the area was fairly deserted at this time. My mother, thinking it was safe, opened the door. To her surprise, she was greeted by a man and a woman dressed in midwifery outfits with hospital badges and everything. They were very polite and asked if they could come inside. They explained that they had been sent by the hospital to check on her and the new baby. My mom let them in, as they appeared to have all the professional attire and badges. They even knew the exact time my mother had given birth, that she had a little girl and her name. These strangers seemed very convincing, and all the information they had was easily accessible in hindsight. My mother, understandably concerned, explained that 2 midwives had already visited earlier that week. She also told them that she was going to call the hospital to confirm their legitimacy. She had not been notified of any additional visits just a day or 2 later. She also warned them that her husband was on his way home from work and wouldn't be happy about this situation. At this point, the pair got defensive and insisted that they would leave. They were pushy about separating the baby from my mother. Finally, she managed to get them to go, and their behavior quickly shifted to calm and apologetic. They assured her that it must have been a mistake and suggested not bothering to check with the hospital. Despite their attempts to convince her otherwise, my mom continued trying to contact the hospital. What made things even stranger was that as my mom opened the door to make them leave, she noticed another person waiting in a car outside with the engine running. It's likely that this was the getaway driver. After they left, my mother was quite scared and immediately called the hospital. They confirmed that they hadn't sent any midwives to visit her. They explained that they would always inform the mother beforehand if they were sending someone, and that they would never request to separate the mother and baby. The hospital also mentioned that they didn't even have a male midwife on staff. My parents were advised to contact the police, which they did. The police took down a description of the individuals, but as far as I know, nothing significant came from it. It's unclear what those people were planning. The fact that they had access to all that personal information, including the exact time of my birth, and were willing to go to such lengths with fake uniforms and badges, is incredibly unsettling. Thank God my mother acted on her instinct and got them out of the house and stuck to her guns. It's even more creepy to imagine what my life would be now if they had gotten to carry out whatever they were planning. I don't believe it was a genuine mix-up. They didn't follow standard protocol and were very insistent on getting the two of us apart. I believe we were very lucky that day. Let me start off by saying I really like to explore old mines. It's kind of a thrill for me because I'm mildly claustrophobic. That sounds weird, I know. Why would someone explore an old mine if they're scared of enclosed places? The thing about it, though, is that it really gives you a kind of rush. When I was a kid, I got lost in a cave, you see. And although it did freak me out quite a bit, it also made me feel so alive. When I began to explore, I chose mines instead of caves because mines are harder to get lost in. Caves are a lot scarier in my mind. Generally, I just travel to the end of the available mine, my heart pounding in my chest the whole way. Then I try to get out as quickly as possible. Each and every time, I swore to myself I would never again go into another mine, but I'd always get the itch to go just once more. Almost immediately after I'd left, I was going to explore a mine in West Virginia. I won't mention the name of it because technically I didn't have a legal right to be there. I actually even had to park my car on the side of the highway and walk there, which was a pretty big risk. There were no cars coming for a while, so I jumped the railing and the fence and made my way over toward that mine. I had done tons of research to try and find where this place was online, so I was able to figure it out pretty quickly. I knew this one was going to be a relatively straight trip from the entrance to the mine to the back. It was about 1,000 feet deep or so. There was a chance that by the time I got to the end, I wouldn't even be able to see the entrance anymore. My heart instantly began racing as I thought of that. Fortunately, although the mine was a bit damp, it wasn't very wet like some of the others I'd encountered, so I wouldn't be having too difficult a time. So there I was, entering the mine, and of course my heart started beating faster right away. I had to walk very slowly because I didn't want to get surprised and trip on anything. No one knew where I was, so if I got hurt, no one would be able to find me, and I'd have to get out of trouble myself. I made a habit of turning around every 50 feet or so to look around and make sure I could still see the entrance. Of course, it got smaller and smaller the further I went into the mine, and the more my heart thudded in my ears and my chest. When I'd gotten halfway deep into the mine, I thought I turned around and saw the entrance was now very, very far away. It was just barely visible. The mine was so dark too. I had a small flashlight with me to see where I was going, but I didn't want to use it until I absolutely had to. As I mentioned before, the only reason I did this in the first place was because I so enjoyed the thrill of being scared, and the flashlight would have kept me from being so. As I descended further into this mine, I thought I heard a sudden sound. It sounded a bit like a giggle or something. I immediately stopped in my tracks and tried to listen a bit closer. After a few moments of nothing though, I decided it must have just been in my head. I began to walk a bit further. About 700 feet into the mine, I heard that same giggle once more. I again stopped, this time feeling my heartbeat leap into my throat. I turned around and looked at how deep I was in. I considered going back for a moment, but I figured this must just be in my imagination. Who the hell would be down here other than me? I wanted to make it as far in as I could go, so I kept on walking. When I got closer to the end of the mine, I heard that giggle again. Only thing was, this particular time, I was absolutely sure I just heard it close by too. It was not my imagination this time. It didn't stop either. It was coming from right behind me. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out my flashlight. I flipped it on, turning around. Sitting right in front of me were two little girls holding their hands over their mouths while they were laughing. They looked at me, and in the darkness, Their eyes looked completely black. One of the girls took her hand away from her mouth for a moment and pointed behind me, further into the mine. I dropped my flashlight in surprise. It broke on the rocks, but I didn't care about that right then. The laughing didn't stop, even though I couldn't see either of them anymore. Immediately, I began to sprint my way back out of the mine. The giggling didn't seem to get any quieter, though. Actually, I thought those girls must be following me. It remained almost completely dark until I was almost back to the entrance of the cave. I didn't dare to look back. I hopped out of that mine and ran to my car, which fortunately was right where I had left it. That was not my last time in an abandoned mine, but I can tell you it was the last time I ever went to that one. I moved to South Korea for university when I turned 18 years old. I'm 21 now, so this happened over 2 years ago. While I've encountered unwanted attention from some guys in the past, most of them eventually got the message that I wasn't interested. However, this particular incident was more unsettling. The university I attend has an institute for language, where all my classes were held at the time. It's well known that most foreigners in this part of Korea would know about or study at this institute. Receiving random Facebook friend requests from guys seeking to learn English or make foreign friends was not unusual. Typically, I'd ignore these requests unless we had a few mutual friends or had met in person. I received a friend request from a guy named Nico, and we had quite a few mutual friends. He messaged me, apologizing for the randomness of the request, and explained that he was trying to make as many foreign friends as possible. He claimed to have many mutual friends, so I accepted his request and replied, saying that it wasn't a bother. From what I could gather from his Facebook photos, he was heavily pierced and tattooed, and he claimed to be Japanese. He had studied in Canada, spoke good English, and was also a foreigner studying at my university. Our initial conversation was casual, but he started to become more aggressive for no apparent reason. Every time I made a comment, he'd find a way to turn it into an argument, which grew tiresome quickly. He often asked if I had a boyfriend, and when I replied that I didn't, he bluntly said that we should be together. At this point, I decided I didn't want any further interaction with him. I politely declined, explaining that I didn't know him. We had never met in person, and we hadn't known each other for even a full week. He didn't take my refusal well and began hurling insults at me based on my looks and making graphic threats of what he'd do to me if he ever saw me. This deeply disturbed me, so I blocked and deleted him on all platforms and tried to forget about it. I mentioned the incident to a friend who immediately recognized who I was talking about. She told me that I wasn't the first girl he had added on Facebook and tried to pressure into meeting him and becoming his girlfriend. After talking to a few more of my friends, listed as mutual friends on Facebook, I realized they had all experienced similar situations involving this guy. One girl even told me she had met him in person, only to find out that he didn't even attend our university, and his personal background details were false. While I felt uneasy about this, I tried not to let it bother me, thinking he'd get bored and move on. However, about a week or two later, I received a message from him on Facebook from a different account, claiming that he had seen me at school that day. This frightened me, as I hadn't considered that he might be watching me in person. I ignored the message and blocked that account as well. A few days later, I began receiving numerous messages from different accounts, all claiming to be Nico's friends. They requested that I unblock him so he could explain everything, and we could talk it over. I ignored all of these messages, believing they were likely from Nico himself trying to get my attention. The more I ignored them, the more violent and aggressive the messages became. I noticed that many of the times he claimed to have seen me, he was lying, making accusations about my whereabouts that weren't true. I knew he was merely making empty threats. However, it escalated when he confronted me in person. I saw him standing beside me in a convenience store at school, and he stared at me silently. I panicked, dropped what I was holding, and fled the store, avoiding going straight home, as I was afraid he might follow me and find out where I lived. Instead, I stayed in crowded areas of the school until a friend came to meet me. After that, I saw him frequently when I left class, and he'd just stand there, watching people as they walked past. He would then fixate on me intensely. I made sure to always be with friends when traveling to and from class and didn't go anywhere alone for some time. However, the messages eventually stopped about a week later, and I haven't seen him again. The last time I heard from him was about a year ago when he messaged me on yet another new Facebook account, asking if we could be friends again because he had changed and claimed it was all just a joke. I ignored that message and blocked that account as well. I have no intention of being friends with him. This incident occurred when I was around 12 years old in the middle of the night at my home. My dad worked the graveyard shift that weekend, and I had stayed up most of the night. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m. when my dad had instructed me to lock the doors and go to sleep, which I promptly did. I went to my room and finally settled into bed. After I went to my room, I had only been asleep for about an hour when I was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of knocking on my back door. It frightened me awake, and after a few moments to process what I'd just heard, I convinced myself it was probably my dad knocking on the door, perhaps having forgotten something. Being mentally exhausted, I knew he had a house key on him, so I thought he'd simply unlock the door himself eventually. However, the knocking continued, and it was becoming quite eerie. Then it stopped abruptly, only to start again at a different location. Someone was knocking on the kitchen window. I continued to reassure myself that it was my dad, but I couldn't understand why he didn't simply unlock the door with his key, which he always had on him. As I thought about this more, fear began to creep in, and I was too scared to check who was outside. I decided I wouldn't answer the door. Instead, my dad would eventually call me to let him in. My phone was right next to me, but I never received that call. The knocking continued at another window, and my fear escalated. I couldn't bring myself to get up and check what was outside. The knocking was relentless, moving closer to my bedroom, and my curtains were sheer enough that I could see outside. But I felt paralyzed. I couldn't scream, talk, or move a muscle. Fear had taken over. I moved my eyes to the window and was startled to see a man peering in through it. He was tall and wearing a ski mask that concealed his face. It was difficult to make out details in the darkness, but I could see a skeleton design on his mask. He tilted his head slightly when he realized I had spotted him, and I tried to say something, but my words got stuck in my throat. I tightly shut my eyes and whispered to myself repeatedly that it wasn't real. When I dared to open my eyes again, the man was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief until I heard a loud whisper from outside. "Open up, or I'll cut you." Everything suddenly fell silent. I could finally move again, but I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. It didn't feel like a dream. Everything was so vivid and terrifying. I don't know what happened that night, but I hope I never have to experience anything like it again. It was one of the most frightening moments of my life. I couldn't find any trace of the man afterward, and as I was home alone that day, there was no one to corroborate my experience. The following morning, when my dad returned from work, I asked him if he had come back earlier and knocked on my doors and windows, but of course, he had not. My mother was a single parent of 3 kids. We were living in fairly modest circumstances, so she worked tirelessly, often around the clock. This meant that my siblings and I spent a substantial amount of time at home without adult supervision. This story I'm about to share happened when I was 14 years old. At the beginning of that particular summer, my older sister had already moved out, and my younger brother was sent to stay with my grandpa for the season. Consequently, I found myself alone at home from approximately 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every weekday. I didn't mind this solitude too much. I passed the time playing Neopets and watching daytime TV, even though it was of questionable quality. One day, I had recently woken up, and my mother had left for work hours earlier. It was around 12 p.m. when I got up to prepare some food, let my dog outside, and settled down on my bed to eat. I remember watching an episode of Rock of Love, and I can recall the exact moment in the show I was watching when this unsettling event occurred. As I sat there, engrossed in the show, I suddenly heard a loud smack against my window. My window had a double setup, requiring 2 blinds and 2 curtains, leaving a tiny gap in the middle where they didn't quite meet. Simultaneously, I heard some logs falling outside my window. We had a pile of firewood for the winter. Curiosity and a touch of concern led me to investigate. I thought that perhaps a branch had hit the window. However, what I discovered was quite shocking. A massive handprint left on my window, right in the small gap between my blinds. I was overcome with fear and couldn't even catch my breath. Terrified, I dialed 911 and then called my next-door neighbor, who was also a family friend. He rushed over as soon as he learned what had happened and caught sight of a man in his mid-40s, sprinting out of my backyard and into the street. My neighbor tried to detain the man until the police arrived, and when they did, I provided them with a detailed account of the incident. The police investigated the man to see if he had a criminal history, but no prior issues came to light. He had been dating and living with another neighbor 3 doors down from my house for a few months. When asked why he was near my window, he claimed he had never been there and was just looking for something. I don't remember his exact excuse. I just recall him saying he happened to be in my backyard. Surprisingly, the police let him go without taking any further action. I waited to hear from them regarding the next steps we could take, but I never received a follow-up. My anxiety intensified, and I took precautions such as installing motion, activated lights outside my window, and ensuring I was never alone while sleeping. Yet these measures were insufficient, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was constantly being watched. I often wondered how this man knew I would be home alone and what he intended to find or do. Fast forward 2 months later, I was staying with my best friend, who lived across the street. We were both in the shower when we saw a shadow approach the bathroom window, which was frosted and didn't allow for clear visibility. I wiped away some of the steam and was shocked to see the same man from the earlier incident, running away from the bathroom as I opened it. I immediately informed my friend, and we called the police again. However, once more, they failed to take any meaningful action. The most frustrating part of this ordeal was that very few people believed me. My mother even dismissed my concerns, claiming that I was too overweight for a man to have any interest in me, and that I was merely being dramatic. Unfortunately, the man continued his disturbing behavior, and it leaves me haunted to this day. I can't help but think about how many others he may have targeted. The woman he was living with at the time had a very young daughter, and that thought terrifies me. It's a grim reminder that danger can lurk in our lives, and we might never even realize it. What could have happened that night if he hadn't accidentally knocked over the firewood logs remains a haunting question. I grew up in the rural area around where we lived. My parents weren't rich or anything, but we did have a fairly decent life. This was in the 70s or so things were a lot different than they are nowadays. It was a lot more common back then to see someone driving down a country road with an open beer between their legs. Although I don't live out in the country now, nor have I in quite a long time, I at least like to think that things like that don't happen nearly as often anymore. I learned to drive myself when I was about 12 years old. This was not unusual for me or my family, and it wasn't too strange either for one of us to take the car out and go somewhere. I had a lot of friends my age who chewed tobacco as well. I tried it a few times, but I didn't really care for it. Around this time, I was good friends with a guy named Vance. We had grown up in the same general area, up on the ridge. Our houses weren't really that close together, but we rode the same school bus to school. We were friends all the way from kindergarten until sometime in high school. The reason the two of us stopped being friends in high school was due to a girl he had liked for years, liking me even more. Although I wasn't really interested in her and would never have dated someone my friend had his eye on, this made him really angry. After a while, he just kind of stopped talking to me. A while further after that, he became very antagonistic towards me as well, which was pretty horrible because no one wants to lose a friend in a situation like that. It's not like I made the girl like me or something. When I was 17 years old, I was home by myself on a weekend night. I decided to take one of the old cars and see a different buddy of mine who lived a bit further up the ridge than I did. It was about an hour's drive to his house since it was a dark dirt road the entire way there. You had to be real careful out on some of these roads. They were right on the sides of hills, and there was not anything like a guardrail to keep you from driving off the side and dying. When I left that friend's house to go home, it was already pretty late. I went outside and could see it was actually a little bit foggy out. It was not ideal to drive this path in that weather, but it just meant I would have to take my time and be more careful when driving. However, it was not too long after I'd begun that I noticed some lights behind me. Another vehicle was now coming my way. The road wasn't really wide enough for more than a car and a half, so this person could not pass me by. Still though, he didn't stop at all. He drove up upon me really fast. In fact, just before he slowed down, I almost thought he was going to slam into me and shove me off the cliff. He had gotten as close as possible to hitting me, then backed off just a bit. When this person was about a car's length behind me, he started to flash his high beams on. Then he sped up just enough to almost slam into me again. Just before he'd hit me though, he slowed down. Now he kept his high beams on, which made it very difficult for me to see the path ahead. I tried to pull my car over just a bit to let this guy pass me by. I was really trying to let him go, assuming that's what he wanted. This guy made no attempt to pass me though. He did the exact same thing. Pulled up really close to me, then backed off again. This time, he began to honk his horn angrily as well. I began to get very nervous. Every time this guy repeated this pattern, I got even more scared. I tried to speed up now, which I was very hesitant to do. I didn't like driving fast down these roads, even when there was not any fog. That didn't change anything though. When I sped up, he matched me perfectly. He kept getting close as if he was going to hit me off the side before backing off yet again. He did this over and over while still honking his horn at me. I don't know how long this kept up, but finally, we got into the bottom of the hill. So there was no risk of running off the side anymore. We were still in a highly forested area though. Thankfully, by that point, I was not far away from home. I thought I could make it there, and at least I knew my family would be home by then. If this guy followed me all the way home, my brothers would be there to help me kick the crap out of him. No sooner than that thought entered my head, however, the car did its same pattern again. This time though, it did hit me. I reacted by slamming the brakes, which caused my car to spin and skid off the road. The only thing I remember after that was nothing. I woke up in the hospital 3 months after the accident. My car had slammed right into a big tree. I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt. In that moment, the only thing that kept me from flying through the windshield was the big steering wheel that my head and chest had bounced off of. I had some pretty bad head injuries, and I had been out for the entire time. I guess I had opened my eyes after a month, but had not been acting like myself. They told me I was aware, but it was like nobody was there. I don't really remember exactly because it was so many decades ago. I had a violent and sort of feral behavior that required me to be restrained to my bed for a while. Then suddenly, one day, the day I felt like I woke up, I just went back to normal. I never found out exactly who was driving that car that rammed me. However, some other people who knew me in high school later told me that Vance had been bragging that it was him after it happened. Vance's dad worked at the police department, so there was never an investigation to see if he had done it. That, of course, convinced me that he had. I don't live out in the country anymore, but I really hope it's harder these days for crooked people to get away with things like that now. My friends and I had begun a bit of a club or group that was based on the MeTV show Jackass. Sure, they told us the stunts were performed by trained professionals, and we shouldn't try them at home. But watching the show, it didn't really seem they were trained particularly well. Plus, we never tried those exact stunts. We came up with our own, and we never tried them at home per se, so we pretty much adhered to their disclaimer. Anyhow, on Halloween night a couple of years ago, I did a really silly dare that ended up freaking the hell out of all of us. We'd been driving down through Utah on our way to Nevada. Yeah, I'll admit we were drinking a bit and probably should not have been driving, but it was Halloween and we were all having a lot of fun. There were 5 of us, and we had done a lot of silly things that night already. We grabbed some whiskey from a liquor store, another thing I do not recommend, and 2 of us had even gone streaking to a Walmart and barely escaped. As the night went on, my friends had a very bizarre dare for me. They wanted me to go into a public restroom, put on an adult diaper, then run out and try to find our car. While it might not seem that extreme of a dare, it was actually fairly intimidating. We found just the restrooms we were looking for on the side of the freeway. There were no less than 10 semi-trucks parked behind the building, but the lights were off in all of them. We assumed the truckers must be sleeping for the night. On the car side of the parking lot, there was not a single car. Of course, that made it a lot easier to find the car when I got out of the stall. So we parked the car and all 5 of us got out and went to the rest area. Not surprisingly, the men's room was disgusting, but I tried to ignore that. I'd already drunk quite a bit of the whiskey and was pumped to show my buddies their dare didn't scare me at all. It was about 1 or so. Technically not even Halloween anymore. But hey, who's here to split hairs? I walked into the stall, got naked, put my clothes over the top, and once my friends handed me the adult diaper over the top, I put it on standing up because there was no way I was going to lay on that dirty-ass floor. My friends all left the men's room. I'm not sure if it was the cool air or the fact I was standing in nothing but a diaper on Halloween night in a public restroom, but it sobered me up just enough to get intimidated by what I was about to do. After walking out, I peeked around and realized I was still alone. Slowly and barefooted, I began to creep out of that bathroom. I was a bit scared now because I really didn't know what to do if someone saw me walking around like this. When I opened the door to the room, I found 2 big, burly truck drivers staring right at me. At first, they looked shocked to see a grown man wearing nothing but a diaper. Then they started laughing at me. Of course, one made a comment about how it must be a fraternity prank. They just walked past me, one of them even slapping me on my diapered ass. Humiliated but exhilarated at the same time, I decided to just make a run for it on the car side of the parking lot. I still saw only 1 car, and it was right in front of the building. It was a blue Pontiac Sunfire as well, and that was our car. Interestingly enough, it was parked backwards in the parking lot. I assumed that was so. Once I jumped in the car, we could just take off. Driving in my bare feet and totally exposed diaper, I sprinted towards that car. I opened the passenger seat, which was emptied as we'd agreed upon, and hopped in, ready to drive away. My heart began to beat even faster, though when I realized I just jumped into the wrong car. Sitting beside me in the passenger seat was this huge man who smelled like absolute crap. He was eating some sort of slop and had his face buried into a wrapper. Looking behind me, the entire back of the car was full of pieces of broken furniture. I had no idea what to think until the man pulled the wrapper off of his face. He looked at me, then looked down at my diaper. Looking back at my face, he smiled a half-toothless grin and wiped his grimy fingers along my face. Then he asked me a question I'll never forget as long as I live. "Do you want it to come with me and be my baby?" He turned the ignition and started the car. I immediately pulled the lever on the door, and the door opened. I jumped to get out. I felt the hand of the man reach out behind me. He grabbed a hold of my diaper and ripped the damn thing off. Fortunately for me, my friends had seen I'd hopped into the wrong car, and they were already driving toward my rescue. I sprinted over to them, completely naked now. As I drove off in the safety of our car, I could hear the man calling out behind me. With those disclaimers on Jackass, I really have to tell you, do not try those kinds of stunts at home. Listen to them. You never know what could happen. I'm 26 and male. have lived on my own for about 2 years now. I have a very small bungalow. I'm able to pretty comfortably afford it. In this bungalow, I have an attic area, and at a guess, I'd say it's about 5 by 5 meters in size. You can only really stand there in the very center. Anyway, I work the night shift at a factory, basically just sitting on my phone all night. So I usually get in at around 8. I was coming home last Monday during a heavy storm. I got into the house and went to sleep right away. When I woke up, I went on my phone and saw that I was so tired that I'd forgotten to check my notifications. I have a Ring camera outside my door, which shows me anyone who would have come into my room. Well, I saw the camera had been tripped at 7:42 a.m. I'd gotten into the house at around 8:10 or 8:15. I checked the video only to see that it was a man. He was pressed right up to the door, fumbling around with the handle. He did this for about 10 seconds until he spotted the camera. Once he did, he very quickly scuttled away. This definitely unsettled me, but it didn't entirely creep me out or anything. I got up to go make some food and discovered something in my kitchen. My back window was wide open. Of course, I instantly began having thoughts of a home invader, but I slowly began to chill out as I convinced myself I just left it open in my tiredness. The rest of my day pretty much entirely consisted of this. I'd notice a small thing that didn't seem quite right and start scaring myself, all up until a point I leave for the shift at 10 p.m. So I was sitting down watching some TV at 9 o'clock before work. I spotted something that made my heart leap into my throat immediately. Out of the very corner of my eye, I could see my attic entrance was very slowly being slid open. I so vividly remembered that I began questioning my sanity. Surely I must just be hallucinating this or something. I looked over to it and saw something that made me so much more scared. I could see fingers wrapped around the hatch, beginning to move it more. The adrenaline was really making my hands and voice shake, but I tried sounding as tough as I could. Then I saw something I don't think I'll ever forget. The hand slipped back into the dark, only for him to drop down completely. I slammed my door shut and locked it as quickly as I could. The call went through, and I was able to get on a line with the police. They dispatched officers to my house. I told them I didn't know if the man was armed or not, and the dispatcher told me to stay on the line. I could hear the man slowly walk up to my door and begin to rattle the door handle. He seemingly went through my cupboards in my kitchen as well, as I began to hear a lot of commotion. Truth be told, I don't know why he stayed. I would have just left the house if it were me, but he stayed all the way until the police arrived and arrested him. Apparently, he was a homeless man and had armed himself with a knife from my kitchen. He'd recently been seen in the area trying to get into many houses. Truth be told, I'm very frightened to sleep still. I now sleep with my bedroom door locked at all times and all my windows sealed shut. I also sleep with a knife under my pillow. I know this is really rare and not something that's likely to ever happen to me again, but I just can't forget the creepy way he dropped down from my attic. That's the story of one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic beginning to really get to me. I wasn't sure if I should leave the house and call the police or if I should try and yell at whoever was up there. I chose a mixture of both. I began dialing 911 and ran to my bedroom where I could lock the door. As soon as I began to run, I heard the hatch almost get torn off with the speed they sheared it, and I arrived at my bedroom door. I looked down the corridor and watched for a moment, seeing only a little slice of the blackness in my attic. Then, though, I saw human hands holding onto the sides of the ceiling and a body lowering itself. When I was a teen, my two friends, who were sisters, would always run away from home. They usually came over to my house on weekends, and then they returned home a couple of days later. One night, I drank for the first time, and the next day, I felt extremely hungover with a real bad headache. I was actually excited to know that this was what the first hangover feels like, so I just relaxed at home. One of my friends called me on the house phone, asking me to come hang out with them. She had found a new hangout spot she'd run away to, close to my apartments, and she wanted me to check it out with her. At first, I was really hesitant because I didn't feel well, but she begged and begged. So eventually, I gave in. It was kind of close to where I lived, but still somewhat far away. I got ready real quick and started walking, feeling a bit shitty. Anyway, I went to my friend's runaway home, and she showed me around. It turned out she found an actual place to stay, and she had her own room there. She explained that she gave the owner of the house some stuff like food, and he let her stay there. Next, she told me we were going to hang out in a particular room. I was surprised and asked, "We? What do you mean?" She said her boyfriend was there as well, and she wanted me to meet him. She loved him so much, and he was so cute and all that stuff. So I went into the room and met her boyfriend. He was a few years older than us, maybe like 3 or 4 years. Also, in the room was a much older man with a shaved head, muscle shirt, and faded prison-looking tattoos. He looked like he'd been through some serious stuff. He was turned around ironing some clothes or something. Immediately, I felt really weird about the situation. They started asking me all kinds of questions, and I tried to be vague with my answers, hoping my friend wouldn't give them any real information. But it seemed like she had set me up, and I felt caught off guard. They offered me a beer, claiming it's a cure for hangovers, and I pretended to drink it. Then, my friend started smoking meth right in front of me, and I declined when they offered it to me. The older man became very excited and insisted I take another beer. I pretended to drink that one too. At this point, the situation was getting even more uncomfortable. The old man came over, laid his head on my lap, and I felt disgusted. I mentioned that I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave. As I tried to make my exit, they tried to block me, but I managed to escape and ran back to my apartment. In the days that followed, I avoided going back there, making excuses whenever my friend invited me. Eventually, my friend's sister told me that her sister was still at that house getting high. She revealed that during one night, when she slept over, the older man had forced himself on her. I'm really glad I didn't stay any longer at that place and kept my distance from those guys and their dangerous lifestyle. Way back when I had this summer job when I was a 15-year-old girl, there was a few miles or so away from my house. I lived in a very rural wooded area, and my parents never let me go into the woods by myself. They worked days though, and my job started at noon every day, so I had to walk to work. During this time, I chose to disobey them and walk through the woods instead of on the road. Walking this way to work would cut about a half-mile off my walk altogether. So every day, around the same time, I'd walk through a very much abandoned state forest down in Deer Path for about a mile or so until it intersected a railroad track. I'd then walk a couple more miles down those tracks into town to my job. Stupid, I know, but I was 15 years old. Taking this path always freaked me out a lot, and I would always feel like I was being watched. It was shorter, though less sunny and less hot as well, so I ignored my instincts, thinking my parents' influence must just be making me paranoid. My parents would pick me up every day after my shift, unaware of this daily routine. This continued on for weeks and weeks. One day, though, I'm out walking about a mile away from any houses, very deep into the woods. I see there are now 2 porn magazine pages that have been ripped out and placed on the trail facing me. They hadn't been there the day before. I was completely creeped out, as these were clearly intentionally placed, probably for me since I didn't know anyone else who utilized this area. I kept walking though. If I turned around at this point, I'd have further to go to get out of the woods, and then there was a huge hill to climb to get back to my house as well. No one would be around there to help me anyway. This particular section was a densely wooded area with brambles and dogwood rolling hills as well, so I couldn't see particularly far in any direction. Suddenly, I could hear someone else walking close by. I stopped in my tracks. I would hear them for a split second, and then they would stop when I stopped as well. As I listened even more closely, I could hear what sounded like change in their pocket. I knew it was not an animal because of the echo of the surroundings, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly where this noise was coming from. Just to check that I was not crazy, I stopped once more. I heard the exact same noise in the silence of the forest, which quickly stopped when I stopped as well. Now I knew I was being followed. My heart was racing with fear. My vision went blurry, but my instincts told me not to speak out, not to run. Just keep walking down this dense deer path further out into the woods. My gut also told me not to look behind me, no matter what. I could sense there was someone right behind me now on the deer path, but I didn't dare to look back. I'm a rather short, chubby person and always have been. Looking at me, you'd probably assume I can't run very fast. So if you wanted to catch me deep in the woods, you might assume you had a lot of time to do so. I kept on walking, seemingly deeper into the woods, because I knew the train track was just up ahead. There would be more space to run without tripping or getting caught on these branches and brambles. It was terrifying. Not looking back a single time, but something kept telling me not to. While I walked, I felt like my entire body was shutting down. It's a feeling I've never felt before or after that day. The feeling of being prey. Everything went blurry. I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears, and my heart was pounding like crazy. I just kept walking like nothing was happening. I did not turn around, but I could now feel someone 5 feet behind me, following me for a good 1/8 of a mile. I didn't turn around. Still, I didn't scream because I knew no one would be there to hear me. As soon as I got near the gravel tracks, which were elevated along a man-made gravel mound, I began to sprint. I ran on all fours up that hill, gripping on weeds to pull myself up faster. I sprinted along the tracks as fast as my lungs and legs would carry me. I could hear and see branches snapping below me in the woods. But now I was out in the sun. The woods were dark, so I couldn't see what was hidden behind those branches. Instead, I kept on sprinting. I never even saw who was chasing me, but I knew their intentions must be awful. After that, I never cut through those woods again. I didn't mention what happened to my parents until I was 18 and had moved out of the house. I was too afraid of being put in trouble or grounded. Looking back, I think that's exactly what this creep was thinking. But you see, back then, even though I was a little bit chubby, I ran cross-country and track and could run a 7-minute mile. Hills, particularly, were my specialty. I had always placed really well in the hilly terrain competitions. By no means was I the best runner, or even a great runner, but I was certainly likely faster than whatever out of shape pedo creep was hanging out in the woods, stalking a little girl. It's not that I was processing this thought at the time. I just instinctively knew it was not time to run, at least not yet. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around the custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case. There were some experiences he related that I had previously been unaware of regarding my ex's behavior out at networking events. After this initial call, he started to call on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. Mind you, this was not someone I knew well prior to the separation. He was also much older than I was, but claimed to be very experienced with divorce and custody. I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him. His testimony was really important to my case, per the words of my lawyer. I kept things strictly friendly, but I always got a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day, and that happened to be a day my son was very sick. When I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me. Honestly, I really appreciated that. After that, though, he kept on dropping by the house uninvited. He would stop by with various gifts for my son. Again, I kept telling myself to simply keep things polite. A divorce was coming soon anyway, and I really couldn't afford to make this guy mad. During this time, He had also helped me set up a security camera system my dad had mailed me. At one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key that same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after that day, he came around once again uninvited and unannounced with magazine photos of decor, and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls altogether and took my son and dog to stay at my parents' for several weeks to avoid another drop in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he must have gotten the hint by now. It was a very quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing. Something like the zoo, I believe. We both came back quite hot and tired. I put my kid down for a nap in my bed and decided to lay down and close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later. It took me a moment to realize that something was way off here. As I was blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table. I had most definitely not put that there. There was a post-it note on it as well, something about planting it in the yard. I recognized the handwriting immediately. I stood up to go splash some water on my face. I tried to decide whether to simply call my parents or phone the police. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized the mirror was now covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages, love notes, and calls of affection. Honestly, it really scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how all this could have possibly gotten into my house in the hour I was asleep. The front door was still definitely locked. As I went from room to room, though, there were notes placed everywhere. I mean, thousands of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets, even one inside my coffee maker. I started to grab all of them and put them into a big pile. Then I got to one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold. You know you're really cute when you think no one is watching you. I realized then that there was a security camera pointed right where that note had been left. The one that man had helped me set up months earlier when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, and I sent them a bunch of photos. My dad insisted I should not call the police. Remember, this was during a custody battle. He said instead he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. That was the initial purpose, at least. This man had access, though, and could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. I realized he had copied my passwords when I was setting up the system. The only way I could figure out that he got into my house is he must have made a copy of my house key the day I gave it to him because my dog had gotten to know him. He wouldn't have bought to try to warn me either. That scared me the most. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put up that many notes very quickly. He must have been right next to me a few feet away from my son while we were both sleeping. And somehow, he thought all this was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what the guy was going to do when he realized he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone on the phone with another friend from out of town at about 10 p.m. The man showed up at my door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be let in. Gone were all of the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left, an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he'd been drinking as well. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts as well, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered he had secretly befriended my mom on Facebook, and therefore was still able to see all of the photos of us she posted or shared. I saw when she left her computer logged on that they were having a conversation about how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing up. I'm more than relieved he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online now. I changed all the privacy settings on my social media accounts. And I avoid all the places he used to go and the networking events he attends. I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos. I was already traumatized enough, and I didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. When I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, we had an early dismissal, which, for those of you who don't know, meant that school went on for longer than half a day, but we still got out an hour or so early. I remember sitting silently in class, working on some math problems when the phone rang. I joked to my friend sitting next to me, hoping it was for me. We all watched the teacher answer the phone because we knew that 90% of the time it meant someone was leaving class. When the teacher's eyes met mine, suddenly, I got pretty worried. I was an anxious kid, so immediately I thought someone must have died. My teacher said something into the phone and then asked me, "When are you getting off the bus today?" I thought this was a pretty weird question because my mom already knew when I would be getting home since she had to leave work early to be there when I arrived. I told my teacher the normal time. My teacher spoke for a few more seconds and then hung up the phone. I asked her what that was all about, and she told me my parent just wanted to check what time I got off. I didn't really think too much about it for the rest of the day. Later, when I got off the bus and walked home without much incident, my mom asked me about my day and took my coat. I remember the exact look on her face when I asked her why she called the school to see what time I was getting off the bus. She looked shocked and said she hadn't called the school. I told her the whole story, and immediately she started making frantic phone calls. I knew right away something was wrong. I sat down and watched some TV while my mom talked up a storm. About 20 minutes later, my stepdad arrived home early from work. About 10 minutes after that, a state trooper pulled up as well. I was pretty scared at this point, thinking somehow I was going to be in trouble. The trooper asked me a few questions, such as whether anyone had ever tried to talk to me while I walked from the bus stop, if I'd ever seen anyone park there who didn't have a kid, or if anyone had ever tried to give me a ride. The answer to all these questions was no. I'd never seen anyone suspicious, as we lived in a pretty nice neighborhood, and it was mostly old retired folks who lived around us. My mom asked me to go upstairs and pack a bag as it was my dad's weekend for visitation. When my dad arrived to pick me up, he was questioned pretty heavily by the trooper as well. I eavesdropped from upstairs, and my mom called me back down, and I left with my dad for the weekend. My dad even taught me some basic self-defense, which I thought was pretty cool. I never heard anything else about the situation, and eventually I forgot about it. Fast forward to today, I've been listening to some creepy narrations on YouTube when I suddenly remembered this whole incident. I asked my mom about it, and what she told me chilled me to my core. She told me that on that day, someone had called the school pretending to be my dad. This man knew my dad's full name, and all the details about my mother as well. He kept saying my mother had told him to pick me up from the bus stop because she wouldn't be able to leave work early. The school didn't even bother calling my mother. The only thing that saved me that day from being abducted was the fact that I had told that man I'd be getting off the bus at the normal time, which was around 3:15. But because it was a shorter day, I actually got off the bus around 1:45. I woke up in the middle of the night, but I wasn't quite sure why yet. Not only did I work 12-hour shifts during the day, which obviously wore me out, but I was one of those really deep sleepers. Even when my alarm clock woke me up, it took me a little while to realize that it was indeed my alarm clock going off. Even then, I had a really hard time shaking the grogginess. After a few moments, I realized my daughter was standing on the side of my bed, trying to wake me up. Apparently, I fumbled around for my glasses, but couldn't remember where I had left them. She was tugging on my sleeve, so I gave up finding them. My wife was out of town, so I had the whole bed to myself. Somehow, I rolled all the way over to the other side. I was so exhausted. I didn't want to do anything. I just gave up and asked my daughter what was wrong. "There's a ghost in my room," she told me, fear evident in her voice. If my wife had been home, she would have let her climb into bed with us. I, however, really didn't like when kids had to get over being scared of the dark. I was not going to indulge their fancies about ghosts and monsters. "Sweetie, there's no such thing as ghosts," I told her. "You need to go back to bed. Daddy has to work in the morning and you can't go to school all tired either." "But there's a ghost in my room. I swear there is," she insisted. I groaned. I didn't believe this sort of nonsense, and I wasn't happy that my daughter was obviously buying into it. I rolled over and managed to pull myself up into a seated position. "Sweetheart, it's not true. Whatever's in your room is just your imagination. Now go back to bed." My daughter paused for a moment and seemed to think about what I had just said to her. "Okay, Dad. Could you at least check my room for me to make sure?" I supposed it would be the best way for me to get back to sleep. "If I check your room, will you go back to bed? I promise," she told me. I hopped out of bed and went out of my room and into the hallway. I felt like I was almost drunk as I stumbled around. I was so exhausted, I could barely even walk straight. The only thing I knew was that when I got back to bed, I might never wake up again with how tired I was. When we got to her room, my daughter jumped into bed and got under the blankets. "Check in the closet, please," she said. Slowly, I made my way over, grabbed the door, rolled it open, and looked inside. Of course, there was nothing there. I let her know this, and she seemed very pleased. "Okay, check under the bed too, will you? Go to bed right after I do," I asked her. She promised, so I staggered over, grabbed the side of the bed to steady myself, and when I had the leverage I needed, I lowered myself down and peeked under the bed. Much like I had expected, there was nothing there. I was about to straighten myself back up when the grogginess started to clear up a little bit. Suddenly, I realized something. My daughter had gone with my wife to visit her parents, and I was supposed to be in the house alone. I felt like my heart stopped as I thought back to that character now on the bed. I quickly jumped up to my feet, only to see that no one was there anymore. Nervous now, and just a little bit scared, I jumped away. I expected someone to reach out and grab my leg or something. Shakily, I made my way back to my bedroom and turned all the lights on because I was pretty scared. I repeated the same routine I'd done in my daughter's room. Checked under my bed, in the closet, and everywhere else as well. Nothing to be found. I slept with a light on that night. When my wife got home, I told her what had happened, and she had a good laugh at my expense. Now, whenever my daughter comes to my room claiming she's seen a ghost or a monster, I just let her crawl into bed with me.